Welcome to the first episode of
What you talking about, Wilbur?
What's up? I am David Long. I'm here to talk to you today about an important integral distinction. What is integral evolutionary spirituality? How do we do it right, and how do people get it wrong? Well, a lot of people tend to agree about what the standard is.
Evolutionary spirituality is distinct. It sort of pushes off against progressive spirituality, while at the same time trying to carry forward the best of progressive spirituality. And the way that it does that is that it's able to harmonize and integrate science and spirituality at a higher level.
And by integral spirituality, they mean a spirituality that includes virtually all of the theories and practices that have to do with transformation of their own consciousness, particularly if it helps put them in touch with the ultimate divine, and not a mythic, literal fairy tale. Post-mythic, science-compatible inner spirituality that gives respect to all other religions.
Harmonize and integrate science and spirituality.
Post-mythic, science-compatible inner spirituality.
We're looking for a fair, overarching, universal standard that harmonizes all the religious traditions as well as science. There is a way to do this. Joseph Campbell, the world's leading comparative mythologist, is an expert at doing just this kind of thing.
Carl Jung's idea, which he calls the archetypes of the collective unconscious.
What do you mean by archetype?
They are expressions of the structure of the human psyche. All the gods, all the heavens, all the worlds are within us. They are magnified dreams. One can say that the images of myth are reflections of spiritual and depth potentialities of every one of us. Through contemplating those, we evoke those powers in our own lives. And to see life as a poem and yourself participating in a poem is what the myth does for you. Every mythology, every religion is true in this sense. It is true as metaphorical of the human and cosmic mystery. But when it gets stuck to the metaphor, then you're in trouble.
The metaphor being?
Well, Jesus ascended to heaven. The story is he ascended bodily to heaven. So this is metaphorical of something. You don't have to throw it away. All you have to find is what it's saying.
What do you think it is saying?
What it's saying is he didn't go out there, he went in here, which is where you must go too, and ascend to heaven through the inward space to that source from which you and all life came. That's the sense of that.
But aren't you undermining one of the great cardinal doctrines of the traditional classic Christian faith, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus?
That would be what I would call the mistaken reading of the symbol. That's reading it in terms of prose instead of in terms of poetry. That's reading a metaphor in terms of the denotation instead of in terms of the connotation. You understand that? It's a purely literary problem. Now, we want to think about God. God is a thought. God is a name. God is an idea. But its reference is to something that transcends all thinking. The ultimate mystery of being is beyond all categories of thought. The best things can't be told because they transcend thought. The second best are misunderstood because those are the thoughts that are supposed to refer to that which can't be thought about, and one gets stuck with the thoughts. The third best are what we talk about, you see. And a myth is that field of reference, metaphors referring to what is absolutely transcendent. The ultimate unqualified mystery is beyond human experience. It becomes inflected. As they say, there is a condescension on the part of the infinite to the mind of man, and that is what looks like God.
So whatever it is we experience, we have to express in language that is just not up to the occasion.
That's it.
It's
That's what poetry's for. Poetry is a language that has to be penetrated. It doesn't shut you off. It opens. It's the rhythm, the precise choice of words that will have implications and suggestions that go past the word is what has to happen. And then you get what Joyce calls the radiance, the epiphany. The epiphany is the showing through of the essence beyond names and forms. No tongue has soiled it. No word has reached it. Words are always qualifications and limitations.
The idea is that religious myths and symbols have to do with human psychology. They don't tell us the ultimate truth of reality. They tell us about ourselves. They're archetypes of the collective unconscious, aspects of human psychology projected outward, and we can do a meta-analysis of what's going on in mythology, and that tells us something about ourselves as humans. It tells us something about the particular cultures in which myths originate, and they can also be poetically true in the ways that they cash out in accord with science.
When the Bible, for example, speaks of God forming us from the dust of the ground and breathing into us the breath of life, that's a true story. It's a traditionally sacred way, what Joseph Campbell would call a mythic way, of talking about the fact that we grew out of the dynamics of the planet itself, and it's the divine creative reality of the whole or ultimate reality that makes that possible, the God that makes it possible. God is not a supreme landlord residing off the planet and outside the universe, a supreme engineer who made this clockwork universe. God is nothing less than a sacred, proper name for that ultimate creative reality, the largest creative reality that includes it all yet transcends it all. Notice, this is a God beyond belief or disbelief. This is a God that is undeniably real in every drop of experience. You may or may not choose to call ultimate reality God, but that reality is itself undeniable. See, we are a subset of the whole. We can't get outside the whole to examine it. So I have to do some analogies and metaphors to describe the nature of ultimacy. What this means, of course, is that there's no one right way to talk about ultimate reality, which I realize is probably preaching to the choir here, but this may be news to many of your neighbors.
Now, I personally am rather passionate about what I call the path of factual faith or sacred realism. I'm a religious naturalist. I have no supernatural or otherworldly beliefs. We are in the largest transformation of religious sensibility in perhaps human history, a second axial age. I call it the evidential reformation, where all the religions of the world are coming to realize that there is no future for humanity or for their faith if we don't come into right relationship to reality. I sometimes say reality is my God, evidence is my scripture, and ecology is my theology.
So I have to do some analogies and metaphors to describe the nature of ultimacy. What this means, of course, is that there's no one right way to talk about ultimate reality.
The problems happen when people don't do it this way. They don't talk about the trans-rational interpretation of symbols, where we're seeing them as metaphoric. If you take the symbols literally true, then you're thinking of it in a rational way, and that means you have to test it by objective rational standards.
Are they the kind of sources that historians would want when trying to establish what probably happened in the past? I think the answer to that question is no.
If you're thinking of the symbols as poetically true, then you have to think about the ways that they poetically cash out. And do they end up being true in that way or not?
What it's saying is he didn't go out there, he went in here, which is where you must go too.
Now, if we're talking about a literal objective claim, then you have to ask, is that a claim that we could even measure? Are they making claims about the absolute truth of reality beyond anyone's ability to know?
There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth, and it's that sense of I amness.
And that's going to be the main distinction between an idealistic perspective and an emergentist perspective, because a scientific emergentist view isn't making claims about absolute truth of reality. It's making claims about the objective aspects of reality that can measure. If consciousness is an emergent property of matter that has happened on the planet, that's not an absolute truth claim. That's something that is within the bounds of science, within our ability to measure. We do have lots of evidence going all the way back, and based on what we currently have now, different creatures at all different stages of development, from the levels of complexity of humans all the way down to the origins of where we think life came from, the most basic cellular stuff and proto and pre-cellular stuff. So we have a pretty good understanding of the way that functions have evolved in correlation to equipment over time. Those are fact claims relating to overarching valid scientific theories, as opposed to these dogmatic, literal, mythical claims, these pre-rational claims.
There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth, and it's that sense of I amness.
That are taken as rationally true instead of as trans-rational poetry. So those are important distinctions to make. So emergentism doesn't negate idealism, but it does negate this idea that consciousness goes all the way down and back, which is the integral claim. That doesn't seem to match up with our best scientific maps. And really, any claim about the absolute is qualifying the unqualifiable, or making unfounded claims, or claims beyond anyone's ability to actually know. So I'm a hard agnostic when it comes to the absolute truth of reality. I really like this quote that says, "He who thinks he knows doesn't know, and he who knows he doesn't know, knows."
God is a thought. God is a name. God is an idea. But its reference is to something that transcends all thinking. The ultimate mystery of being is beyond all categories of thought. The best things can't be told because they transcend thought. The second best are misunderstood because those are the thoughts that are supposed to refer to that which can't be thought about, and one gets stuck with the thoughts. The ultimate unqualified mystery is beyond human experience. It becomes inflected. As they say, there is a condescension on the part of the infinite to the mind of man, and that is what looks like God.
If religions are right, they're probably right on accident, not because there's something about a mystical experience that tells us the absolute truth of reality. And as we have seen, and as we will see, mystics make contradictory claims. It's not like all mystics all over the world are coming to the same conclusion. They're coming to different conclusions, and that kind of shows their methodology is bad. How it usually goes is there's the dogma, and there's a religious experience, and then the religious experience gets interpreted in terms of the dogma, and the experience validates the dogma. Like Christians will say, oh, I know Jesus died for my sins because I feel it in my heart. And as we know, that's not a good way to know about a historical fact based on personal feelings. So emergentism and idealism are not necessarily incompatible, but emergentism does show us that there's no need in terms of explanatory power to postulate idealism as a source for life. And it gets into all kinds of problems of its own, especially anthropomorphism and infinite regress. What winds up happening in some cases, like in Ken Wilber's case, he wants to say that Buddhist interpretations are basically the one true way.
That's a literal Cohen. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth. And it's that sense of I amness. The journey of enlightenment, if you want to put it in a simplified form, is the journey that moves you from your empirical self, anything that you can see or know about yourself, any object, to pure awareness, pure self, your true self, the self that cannot be made an object, but is the space in which all of this is arising. That's a literal Cohen. That's not a symbolic thing.
Joseph Campbell, probably the recent era's greatest mythologer and interpreter of mythology, and somebody I certainly cut my teeth on. I was a great admirer of his and thought really extraordinary work that he did. He used to very, very vehemently, actually, say that there's really sort of two types of mythology. Your mythology performs two different functions. He wouldn't use the terms pre-rational and trans-rational, but the way we're talking about them is the way he would talk about these two functions of mythology. And the first function is when mythology is taken to be concretely real. The fundamentalist, religious believer, they don't take these things metaphorically. These are not symbols of some higher truth. These are the truth. No, Moses really parted the Red Sea. This doesn't symbolize anything. All of those would be what Campbell would call the concrete, literal belief in mythology. But what some people do, particularly educated, intelligent people like us that are trying to get some meaning in our lives, we can tend to take myths as deeply symbolic of something else.
That's a literal Cohen. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth. And it's that sense of I amness.
The fundamentalist, religious believer, they don't take these things metaphorically. These are not symbols of some higher truth. These are the truth.
And not a mythic, literal fairy tale.
What you talking about, Wilber?
He talks about I amness before the Big Bang. He's making this literal cosmological claim. And you can't just say that when he's talking about I amness before the Big Bang, that he's talking about some kind of meditative injunction or something like that, some kind of poetic way of talking about an experience. It's built into his cosmology, this idea that consciousness goes all the way down and back and pre-exists the Big Bang.
That's a literal Cohen. That's not a symbolic thing.
That's his worldview based on a literal interpretation of mythology. And then on the other side, you have someone like Steve McIntosh, who I've also made a video about. He also would agree with the same standard.
Harmonize and integrate science.
Science compatible.
But he also wants to postulate an exterior, loving being.
The love of God, a source of reality which can love and be loved.
So they both are talking about a consciousness that pre-exists the Big Bang, but they're on different sides. One's this outside creator, and one's this inside awakening as the universe consciousness. So the Eastern tradition has that inside, God awakening as the universe. The Christian tradition has that outside, God as the creative designer, intelligent designer, and loving outside transcendent force. They are contradictory ideas. So they don't harmonize with each other. And neither one of these philosophies harmonizes with science. Science seems to show a more emergentist perspective, where consciousness is the outgrowth of life on a particular planet, that it doesn't go all the way down and back. And that in the way that the integral quadrant map shows, we can pretty easily map functions of consciousness correlated to hardware, so software to hardware. We are biological machines. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself. There's no extra stuff put in from some transcendent source. It's just the universe. We don't need to postulate extra things in terms of explanatory power. These idealistic ideas about transcendence before the Big Bang or an intelligent designer are ideas from mythology before we understood the micro and macro scales, before we had telescopes and microscopes. These are human-centric, anthropocentric projections that don't really solve anything. They just get caught up in this infinite regress where, well, what's the source of reality? Oh, it must be some human somewhere that does things for a reason or awakes as the universe. So people have tried to solve this problem of origins, but they just wind up right back where they started again, not understanding, well, where did God come from or whatever. They talk about this transcendent thing that is infinite, but why not save a step, as Carl Sagan would say, and just say that our universe is infinite?
Where did God come from? If we decide that this is an unanswerable question, why not save a step and conclude that the origin of the universe is an unanswerable question? Or, if we say that God always existed, why not save a step and conclude that the universe always existed? There's no need for a creation, it was always here.
We don't need to postulate any other types of further things out in terms of explanatory power. Our maps make sense just fine without postulating some kind of transcendent creative force. People postulate the fruits of evolution as if they were the source of evolution. So things that have evolved over millions of years to get to the point to where they're at, those are actually the original source of things. Like it was all love or intelligence, being and awareness or consciousness or something like that. All of those things that it's taken millions of years of evolution to develop are actually the source of everything. And then, of course, that begs that question, where did that come from? And that gets back into that infinite regress, which is so unsatisfying. So the way to harmonize all these perspectives is to understand the fact that humans are storytellers. What we do is that we tell stories. And back before science, our stories weren't even as literal. The ways that we would try to talk about the world were not as accurate in general. We were speaking very vaguely and poetically. And yeah, definitely some people eventually took some of those vague poetic ideas more and more literally, and then as time went by further and further, we started to really want to test these claims and figure out, is this really literally true or not? And it turns out, that in most cases it's not. A lot of religious ideas have been debunked, and so you can pretty much push them down the slippery slope. But the idea is when you realize that all of these symbols are true poetically, then you don't have to throw them out. You can find the still relevant poetry within these ideas.
When the Bible, for example, speaks of God forming us from the dust of the ground and breathing into us the breath of life, that's a true story. It's a traditionally sacred way, what Joseph Campbell would call a mythic way, of talking about the fact that we grew out of the dynamics of the planet itself, and it's the divine creative reality of the whole or ultimate reality that makes that possible, the God that makes it possible. You may or may not choose to call ultimate reality God, but that reality is itself undeniable.
And we also know that objective symbolism is also relative language. It's just that science and logic are really well qualified. The Enlightenment project is to have a very consistent and well qualified map of understanding. And so it is very true and consistent within itself. And it makes sense that it's a more accurate way of talking about things, especially in the time that we live in, that we would want to develop something like this. But that doesn't mean that previous mythologies or previous symbol sets aren't true in a way, or don't tell us things about what it is to be a human being and how to live.
There's no one right way to talk about ultimate reality. So I have to do some analogies and metaphors to describe the nature of ultimacy.
In some ways, those poetic truths ring a lot deeper than a lot of scientific facts, because humans are storytellers. We are narrative-driven machines.
Poetry is a language that has to be penetrated. It doesn't shut you off. It opens. It's the rhythm, the precise choice of words that will have implications and suggestions that go past the word.
There is a universal idea behind the cosmology of Christianity, of Buddhism, of paganism, and of science, and it's this idea of absolute unity and interconnectedness. It's the at-one-ment, or I and the Father are one, or the body of Christ of Christianity. It's Buddha nature, and all is one in Buddhism. This returning to source and this realization that we're all archetypes in the mind of God, or that we're all part of a collective dream. And the dream is the illusion of separateness. That's what ego is this false idea about a separate self. when the absolute truth is that all is one. In paganism, the idea is that we're all parts of nature. And of course, that resonates with science as well as this idea about the fractal or holonic nature of reality. The idea that E equals mc squared, that all of manifest reality is a part of the same energy field. So there is a way to make these cosmologies harmonize, and there is a way to make this poetry cash out in real and good and true ways. We are meaning makers, so we want to tell a good story. And part of what philosophy is doing, part of what religion is doing, part of what science is doing is trying to tell the best story. And these projects, to some extent, can come together and harmonize and figure out the best way to tell the best story and to fulfill all the functions of a healthy religious tradition, which is an important part of being a human. Religions serve particular functions. Like Joseph Campbell says that when a religion or a mythology is working well, that it serves four main functions. The first function is the mystical function, which opens up the mystery of reality, which is also your mystery. The second function is the cosmological function, which is to incorporate the knowledge and understanding of the day. The third function is the sociological function, which binds together a group with roles and rules. The problem is that if we don't have an up-to-date cosmological function, then those roles and rules are out of date for another time, for another world. And so it's really important that we get our ideas right and that we align ourselves with a skillful epistemology and a good cosmology in a way that's open to science, so that way our religion can be open to evolution and refinement, and that's not going to be out of date with the times.
We are in the largest transformation of religious sensibility in perhaps human history, a second axial age. I call it the evidential reformation, where all the religions of the world are coming to realize that there is no future for humanity or for their faith if we don't come into right relationship to reality.
The fourth function is the pedagogical function, which moves the individual through the inevitable stages and crises of life. These are the reasons why religion is important to people. These are the reasons why it's important to have a good story. And this is the reason why it's important to get these ideas right. So this is a fail, in my opinion. This is not a book about the religion of tomorrow. This book is an example of how to get it wrong. This book is an example of an integral case for why Buddhism is the true way.
But every true believer, every ethnocentric religionist in any religion, believes in jihad of one form or another, ranging from mild to extremist. That is, ranging from more tepid forms of preaching or ministering or trying to convert infidels and unbelievers, to a middle range of coercing a forced belief through one means or another, to truly violent extremist end of torture and actual killing warfare, eliminating unbelievers if you can't convert them. So what we look for in any religion is whether it is at a rational, world-centric, or higher level of growing up in the spiritual intelligence line. Less than that, and it will be involved, covertly or overtly, in some form of jihad. And it certainly will not be able to engage in any form of genuine interspirituality. It believes it has the one and only true way. How could it possibly be involved in an interspirituality that gives respect to all other religions?
And the way he gets it wrong messes up his metaphysics, and it messes up his view of development, so it has some pretty major consequences. When you start twisting the map to look like what you would like it to be instead of trying to figure out what it actually is, you get into all kinds of problems, trying to justify your bias. Same goes for these McIntosh books. It's just another example of trying to make an integral sounding case for one's own particular religious biases.
What always happens when people want to push the great religions into one box, into one mountaintop, right, rather than many mountaintops, is you come up with your own ad hoc idea of what the mountaintop is, right? Oops, it just happens to be my vision of what religion should be, right? So maybe there's one God who maybe sounds and talks and walks a lot like Jesus, or maybe it's the mystical experience, which just happens to be the piece of religion that you value, or maybe it's compassion, which just happens to be your particular preoccupation with what the religion should be doing. But in any case, it's you.
Really, the only person doing integral evolutionary spirituality in public that I see who seems to be really doing it right and not making these kinds of claims is Michael Dowd. Michael Dowd cashes out his poetry in ways that line up with science.
Now, I personally am rather passionate about what I call the path of factual faith or sacred realism. I'm a religious naturalist. I have no supernatural or otherworldly beliefs. I sometimes say reality is my God, evidence is my scripture, and ecology is my theology.
Michael Dowd recognizes that his symbol set is just one poetic way of talking about absolute mystery and absolute reality.
There's no one right way to talk about ultimate reality.
So Andrew Cohen also talks about evolutionary enlightenment, but he tends to side more with Wilber in terms of thinking that there is some kind of pre-existent consciousness.
God, the unmanifest or unbecome God, God before the universe was created, right?
I don't know that.
Realize that for every exterior there's an interior, then you're going to see the interior is always going to be part of the process. And so what's driving the process is coming from the interior.
I have recently talked to Andrew Cohen, and I was talking to him about just this problem, and he seems to agree with me that there needs to be this kind of universal, overarching, fair standard that harmonizes all the traditions. And he agrees with me that people within Integral have contradictory views, that they sound like they're saying the same thing, but when you really dig into the details, they're not saying the same thing. They're talking about different things. So what we need to do is we need to come together and we need to figure out how to make this universal standard work. Integral can't just be another green swamp. It can't just be like this person thinks this over here and this person thinks this over here, and we just act like it's all the same thing and do some far-sighted mishmashing. That's a problem with green integration. We integrate diversity with discernment. We need to put these ideas to the test. We need to figure out what's actually going on. We need to refine together and push this thing forward together, because we need to figure out what the fair standard is, because at the end of the day, it's not just about my integral practice and your integral practice. What we're really trying to do is to create a new future system where we get this stuff right. And that's why it can't just be us justifying the local thing that we like or our particular fun thing. We really need to think about what the fair, overarching, universal standards are that are going to stand up over time to new science and new information, and that are going to be open to truth in this kind of way. We need to figure out what those standards are, so when we put this new system forward, it doesn't become obsolete in a few years, or it doesn't just become the new superstition. It becomes something that's actually good and healthy and doesn't step on its own tail.
One of the things that God, reality, has been revealing through evidence, through evolutionary psychology and evolutionary brain science, among other places, is that we have self-deceptive instincts. And that's why we need the collective. Scientists are just as prone to self-deception as anybody else, but the community of scientists, where there's motivation, where there's incentive to prove each other wrong, is usually a good thing in the long run in terms of helping our theories and our understandings of reality come into a closer alignment with the way reality really is.
So as of yet, we haven't really seen anybody who's really integral in a way where they transcend and include multiple religious traditions without favoring one exclusively. We see like the hack into Buddhism, the hack into Christianity. We haven't really seen the pagan version of it, like the hack into the occult symbolism. That needs to be included as well. Self-mastery is a major missing other side of the coin to the self-transcendence talk that we're doing. But we haven't really seen the person who can speak all of these languages and be multilingual really come forward and step up and be like, this is how you integrate all these traditions and they harmonize with science. But that's what we really need. So we've got some translations or some hacks into previous traditions. But what I'm talking about is a transformative new system that transcends and includes the previous systems. Not just translating to different people in different traditions, but a totally new transformational integral religious tradition. So the real religion of tomorrow, the real integral evolutionary spirituality, should be multilingual, should be able to speak about the human condition and what it is to live the good life through the symbol sets of multiple traditions, and I would say including other mythologies too, like Star Wars and The Matrix and Lord of the Rings and things like this, as well as having an integral spiritual practice that has a practice for all four quadrants and probably practices from multiple religious traditions. The service to others from Christianity, the self-transcendence from Buddhism, the self-mastery from paganism, and the non-superstition and rationalism from science. They should be able to do all of these things without any kind of superstition and without making claims about things that we don't actually know to be true. That's integrity. That's skillful integration. The closest thing I've seen to it is Joseph Campbell. He's the godfather of a real integral religion and an integral religious theory. Maybe to some extent it all goes back to him.
To see life as a poem and yourself participating in a poem is what the myth does for you. Every mythology, every religion is true in this sense. It is true as metaphorical of the human and cosmic mystery. But when it gets stuck to the metaphor, then you're in trouble.
That's a literal Cohen. That's not a symbolic thing.
What you talking about, Wilbur?
So this video talked about a lot of things. We talked about the 4 quadrants, and if they go all the way down and back. We talked about idealism versus emergentism. We talked about the pre-trans fallacy. We talked about contradictions. We didn't really get into it, but there's also some issues with looking in the right quadrant for data and a good methodology in terms of integral methodological pluralism and an integral epistemology. These videos might have a lot of overlap because a lot of these ideas are interwoven so deeply that it's hard to really just talk about one at a time. So I'm gonna try to talk about one at a time to try to make these things somewhat short. I'm gonna try to keep them all under 30 minutes, but it becomes really difficult. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. I have lots of videos that I would suggest as further information. Check down below in the description. I'll put videos on integral epistemology. I'll put videos on the pre-trans fallacy. I'll put videos on idealism versus materialism. I'll put videos on my criticism of Steve McIntosh. I also have videos on religious symbolism, on an integral spiritual practice and what that looks like. Looking forward to seeing your comments below. If you like what I'm doing and you want to see more, please support me on Patreon. I could really use the support. Make sure you like and subscribe. Share this on your social media and tell your friends. Much love and respect. Peace.